Welcome to the Growth Mindset Center YouTube. Please take a moment of your precious time and generosity to click the subscribe button, comment. Thank you very much. Please listen to the next great content. Ever wondered why some succeed silently while others shout but never grow? This will explain why. There's a deeper reason you're stuck, and it's not what you've been told. These insights will change how you act. When you stop waiting for motivation and start building momentum, everything transforms. Let's uncover how. It's not a result of luck, or timing, or wishful thinking. It's not about being in the right place at the right time. It's about being the right person. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional every time. And that's not something that happens overnight. It's the product of clarity, consistency, structure, and strategy. Lasting success, real sustained, deeply rooted success requires more than talent. It requires more than ambition. It demands intention. Most people don't fail because they lack potential. They fail because they lack alignment. They're working. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, hard, but on the wrong things. They're busy but not building. They're chasing but not anchoring, and in the absence of strategy, effort becomes exhausting. Without direction, energy becomes noise. And before they realize it, they're grinding themselves into burnout without ever producing the results they wanted. Lasting success is never just. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional about reaching a goal. It's about becoming someone who can sustain it. And that requires building your life on something deeper than emotion, something stronger than motivation. You need principles that don't change when your mood does. Systems that don't collapse under pressure. A mindset that doesn't require constant rescue. You don't build long-term success with. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Short-term behavior. You build it by stacking wins. Small ones, daily ones, often uncelebrated ones. By refining your process, by aligning your standards with your identity, by mastering the basics, so consistently that they compound into greatness. Not all at once, but inevitably. This is what separates the ones who succeed for a season from the ones who... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Lead for life. The ones who go viral from the ones who go the distance. The ones who perform under pressure from the ones who collapse under convenience. They all have access to the same time, the same tools, the same information. But only a few of them build something that lasts. And this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The reason is simple. Strategy. Not flashy ideas, not motivational slogans. Strategy. Clear, aligned, executed strategy. Built from truth, not trends. Anchored in principle, not performance. Focused on building something real, not just something impressive. That kind of strategy works in every season, in every economy, at every level, because it's not dependent on hype. It's designed for sustainability. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Are 5 strategic approaches that will help you build lasting success. Each one works on its own, but together they create a structure that's nearly impossible to shake. A rhythm that won't burn you out. A path that won't pull you into chaos. A mindset that won't require you to constantly restart your journey. These strategies are. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, not one size fits all. They require reflection. They require leadership. They require that you pay attention to how you're operating, not just what you're chasing. Because anyone can run fast, but not everyone can run far. And if you want your success to last, it has to be built for endurance. That's what these 5 approaches. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, are 4. To help you lead yourself with consistency, to help you navigate the noise, to help you think clearly, move wisely, and grow steadily even when things don't go your way. Especially then, because that's when your strategy matters most. The first strategic approach to build lasting success is this: build your life around. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Principles, not preferences. Preferences change, principles don't. Preferences are emotional, circumstantial, and often short-lived. They're driven by how you feel in the moment, by comfort, by pressure, by energy. Principles are rooted, they're steady. They are the truth you stand on when everything else around you is shifting. If you build your life around preferences, This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Always need motivation to act. You'll always need the conditions to feel just right. You'll start strong, but you'll fade quickly, because preferences will let you off the hook when things get uncomfortable. They'll negotiate with your discipline. They'll tell you, it's okay to skip today. You've earned a break. This one thing won't hurt. And one skip standard turns into a new. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Norm. But when your life is anchored in principle, you don't need permission to be consistent. You don't need hype to follow through. You don't need to feel ready to execute. You act because you've already decided. You lead because it's who you are now, not something you're trying to become someday. A principle-led life is clear. It's simple. It's powerful. Because this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Principles create boundaries. They protect your energy. They filter your decisions. They keep you in alignment. And alignment is what allows you to move with confidence without needing every detail figured out. When you have principles, you don't need to debate every decision. You don't waste time asking yourself whether you should or shouldn't. You already know. You've already chosen. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. From the path, you already have a standard that speaks louder than your feelings. And that's what gives you an edge when things get noisy. Your principles are your compass. They keep you from drifting. They remind you who you are when your mind is tired and your emotions are high. When life gets heavy, your feelings will try to lead. But if you trained this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Principles to lead instead, you'll keep moving in the right direction. Ask yourself right now, what are the principles that govern your life? Not what you hope to live by, but what you actually live by. When pressure rises, what guides your behavior? When things go wrong, what determines your response? If your answer is whatever I feel like, then you're bold to know. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Life is reactive, not strategic. Strategic people don't wait to feel aligned. They stay aligned by honoring their principles. They build their schedule around their values. They choose habits that reflect who they want to become, not who they were yesterday. And that's the difference. Not talent, not motivation, structure built from values. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Of your principles is integrity, then cutting corners isn't an option, even if it's easier. If one of your principles is growth, then staying comfortable is not something you reward. If one of your principles is excellence, then you don't show up at 70% and call it done. You lead with standard, not emotion. And this is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Beautiful thing about principles is that they scale. You don't outgrow them. As your responsibilities increase, your principles become even more important. They keep your foundation strong. They help you grow without losing yourself. They help you move faster without falling apart. Too many people build success around momentum, but momentum fades. Life gets. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional in the way. Distractions multiply, and if you're not built on principle, you'll collapse. You'll fall back into old patterns, you'll burn out trying to rebuild motivation. But when your success is anchored in who you are, not just what you do, you become resilient, you become consistent, you become sustainable. So this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. A moment and decide what kind of person you want to be when no one's watching. What kind of behavior you will no longer tolerate from yourself. What kind of actions you'll take even when it's hard. That's your foundation. That's the version of you who can lead, perform, and grow for the long term. You don't need more information. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You need a system for how you live, one that isn't based on your mood, one that isn't altered by pressure, one that keeps you grounded even when life throws chaos your way. That's what principle gives you. When the storms come, and they will, your preferences will fall apart, but your principles will hold. They will be the difference. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Between starting over and continuing forward, between panicking and leading, between collapsing and rising stronger. Because building a principle-driven life isn't about being perfect. It's about being prepared. It's about making the decisions ahead of time. So when things get hard, you don't have to wonder who you are. You already know. You've already trained. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional for it. And now you move with confidence. The second strategic approach to build lasting success is this: build systems that work even when your emotions don't. Because if your success depends on how you feel, it won't last. Your emotions will lie to you. They'll shift based on sleep, stress, feedback, fear, and even weather. And if this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, you let them lead. They'll pull you in 100 directions before noon. Systems are what keep you anchored when your feelings want to flee. A system is a pre-decided path. It's the discipline of acting before you feel like it. It's the structure that supports the version of you you're building, not the version of you you're leaving. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Behind. Systems don't care about how you feel. They care about what works. When you build a system, you make success repeatable. You take the guesswork out of growth. You stop hoping that you'll stay focused. You make it automatic. You stop relying on motivation. You build momentum with rhythm. You don't need willpower to do what's already. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, scheduled, structured, and tracked. Most people burn out not because they're doing too much, but because they're deciding too much. They're waking up every day trying to reinvent the wheel. What should I do today? What's my priority? What time should I start? What should I focus on first? That decision fatigue eats away at your bandwidth. And this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The time you're ready to act, the day has already slipped away. But when you build systems, the decisions are already made. You're not wondering what to do. You're executing. You're not debating your standard. You're living it. You don't need a perfect day to win. You just need to follow the process. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. System is simply a set of behaviors reinforced by structure, executed with consistency. Your morning routine is a system. Your workout rhythm is a system. Your lead generation, your content, your conversations, everything can be systemized. And the more you systemize, the more capacity you create. Capacity is the ability. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. To carry more without collapsing, without getting overwhelmed, without losing clarity. And systems are what create that space. They give you margin, they reduce chaos. They make your focus sustainable because now you're not living in a loop of last-minute decisions. You're leading with strategy. The highest performers. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. In the world, don't work harder than everyone else. They've just removed the friction. They've taken the things that matter and made them automatic. Their systems do the heavy lifting. Their routines carry the weight. And because they're not constantly fighting for focus, they have energy left over to innovate, to lead, to perform. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional at a higher level. This is where most people get it wrong. They think structure is restrictive, that if they build systems, they'll lose freedom. But the opposite is true. Structure is what creates freedom. Because when your life is organized, when your habits are aligned, when your day is planned, you gain time, not. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Lose it. You gain control, not rigidity. Systems don't remove creativity, they protect it. Because now your mind isn't consumed by chaos. It's focused, available, present. You don't need to waste energy remembering the basics. You've automated them. And that gives you the space to go deeper, to think longer, to lead better. So, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. What should your system include? Clarity, simplicity, repeatability. You shouldn't need a 2-hour window to start. It should be easy to begin, clear to follow, and satisfying to finish. The more friction you remove from starting, the more likely you are to continue. Build your system around triggers. Wake up, first action. Sit at your desk. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. First block, end the day, final review. Create rituals that start the process, that reinforce the identity, that move you into motion without needing a pep talk. You're not building systems for your best days. You're building them for your worst ones. The days when you're tired, when you're overwhelmed, when your emotions try to sabotage this is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional focus. That's when your system saves you. That's when the structure catches the fall. And when your system becomes your normal, you stop feeling like you're starting from scratch every week. You're not reinventing anything. You're refining. You're optimizing. You're stacking progress. You're moving from motion to momentum. That's how real success is built. Not through intense. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Spurts of effort, but through sustainable systems that work regardless of how you feel. That don't rely on excitement. That don't need you to be perfect. That just asks you to be present and to keep showing up. The third strategic approach to build lasting success is this. Think long-term while acting. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, with urgency. It sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. Most people are either stuck obsessing over the future or lost in the chaos of the present. They're either dreaming about someday or drowning in the noise of today. But the people who build something that lasts, who don't just succeed once but stay successful, they know this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. How to hold both at the same time? They think long-term, they know where they're going, they build with the end in mind, but they also move with urgency. They act like their goals matter now, they treat every day like it's expensive because it is. And that combination, that tension between vision and execution, that's what gives them their edge. You have to play. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The long game. Because real results, real transformation, real leadership, it all takes time. It takes compounding effort. It takes seasons of refining, of failing forward, of planting seeds and not seeing the harvest for a while. You can't microwave meaningful success. You build it brick by brick, standard by standard. But just because it takes time doesn't mean you move. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Slowly. Too many people use the long game as an excuse to procrastinate, to delay decisions, to wait for permission. But urgency doesn't mean rushing. It means moving like your future depends on it. It means acting like the version of you you're becoming is watching everything you do. Urgency means you don't waste days. You don't. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Waste windows. You don't play games with your potential. You stop treating your time like it's unlimited and start treating it like it matters. You make the call. You write the words. You show up sharp, not sloppy, not vague, sharp. That urgency is what builds trust with yourself, with others, with your future. Because every time you move with intention, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You reinforce that your goals are not optional, that your success is not a someday hope. It's a now priority. And when you live like that, things begin to accelerate. The long term gives you direction. The urgency gives you pace. And the combination of the two gives you traction. Because now you're not just dreaming, you're building, not just planning. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You're producing, not just thinking, you're leading. So, how do you apply this? You set goals that stretch into the future, but you work them backwards until today has a clear job. You define what success looks like 5 years from now. But you ask, what does that version of me do this week, this morning, in the next hour? Because this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The future isn't waiting. And you don't need to do everything today, but you need to do something. Something that compounds, something that builds muscle, something that reinforces your standard. And when you stack those actions over time, the results aren't just big, they're inevitable. You stop wasting time wondering if it's working. You start showing up because it's who. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and Momentum is no longer optional. You are now. You lead yourself every day like the opportunity is now, not next week, not when it's easier, not when you feel like it. Now, that's the urgency. And when you combine that urgency with patience, something rare happens. You stop rushing, you stop chasing, you stop trying to force results that aren't ready yet. You stay calm. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Stay committed. You become a steady, powerful force, the kind of person people trust, the kind of leader who lasts. Because the people who build long-term success aren't obsessed with shortcuts. They don't look for hacks. They understand process. They understand seasons. They understand that some of the most important work you'll ever do is invisible. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Silent, uncelebrated, but essential, and because they've learned how to act now without demanding results now, they can keep going longer. They don't burn out. They don't quit every time progress slows down. They've trained themselves to trust the compounding effect of aligned effort. And that trust, that's what gives them peace. You can't just think long term. You have to. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Train your life to support it. Your schedule, your habits, your conversations, your systems, they all need to reflect where you're headed, not just where you are, because you're not building for the season you're in. You're building for the future you've already decided to create. The fourth strategic approach to build lasting success is this: build internal stability before external achievement. If this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, you don't feel strong on the inside. Nothing you build on the outside will ever feel secure. You can succeed on paper, hit goals, make money, gain recognition. But if you're constantly anxious, constantly comparing, constantly afraid of losing it, that success will feel like a burden instead of a blessing. And that's what happens to most. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. People. They chase external validation to fix internal instability. They think once they reach a certain number, a certain position, a certain level of applause, they'll finally feel at peace. But the peace never comes, because peace is not a reward for achievement, it's a byproduct of alignment. Real alignment starts internally, not with hype, not with pretending, but with, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Knowing who you are, what you stand for, what your values are, what your non-negotiables are. And when those things are clear, success doesn't shake you, pressure doesn't break you, disappointment doesn't define you. This is what separates the people who stay grounded in chaos from the ones who spiral. The ones who perform consistently versus those who... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Burnout. The ones who keep showing up when the results slow down versus the ones who disappear when the pressure rises. Internal stability is what carries you through. You don't build that stability by avoiding adversity. You build it by facing it. You build it by sitting with your patterns, examining your thoughts, studying your... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Reactions, you build it by becoming someone who doesn't flinch every time something doesn't go their way. Because challenges will come, criticism will come, setbacks, failure, delay, doubt. They're all part of the journey. And if you're still emotionally dependent on other people's validation or external results to feel worthy, your success will never last. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes Commitment and momentum is no longer optional. It will always feel fragile, conditional, exhausting. But when you've trained your internal state, when you've built strength from within, you walk into any room with certainty. Not arrogance, not loud confidence, just a quiet, calm strength. The kind that says, I don't need this moment to validate me. I brought my value with me. And this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. When you live like that, you're free. Free from needing to be seen. Free from chasing things that don't matter. Free from being emotionally hijacked every time something unexpected happens. That's where power lives. Not in control, but in composure. That kind of composure is rare because most people don't train it. They chase results, but this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. Don't train their nervous system. They chase growth, but they don't study their emotions. They chase leadership, but they've never learned how to lead themselves under pressure. You build internal stability through daily habits, through rituals that center you, through solitude, through reflection, through honesty, through facing your pain instead. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Of masking it through building a relationship with yourself that is rooted in trust. It's easy to look strong when everything is going well. But what happens when the storm hits, when the plan doesn't work, when your effort isn't enough? That's when your foundation is tested. And if it was built on performance alone, it will crack. But if it was built on presence, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. On purpose, on truth, it will hold. Build from there. Build from inner peace. Build from identity, from clarity, from knowing your values so deeply that no external voice can pull you off track, that no criticism can make you question yourself. The no win or loss changes your worth. The stronger your inner world, the more resilient your outer world becomes. Because when your identity is secure, you stop attaching. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. It to numbers, to titles, to outcomes. You don't fall apart when things don't go your way. You don't collapse when the applause fades. You lead calm, clear, steady. Lasting success requires more than performance. It requires presence. It requires that you show up to the same challenge with the same standard, the same integrity, the same integrity. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Focus, regardless of who's watching, regardless of what the outcome looks like. That's internal stability. That's self-leadership. The fifth strategic approach to build lasting success is this. Elevate through refinement, not reinvention. Most people think the next breakthrough will come from doing something completely different. They think they need a new business. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. New strategy, a new environment, a new start. But more often than not, they don't need new. They need better. They don't need to start over. They need to refine what's already working. Success isn't about constantly pivoting. It's about paying close attention to what's already in motion and sharpening it, not just once, but continuously. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The highest performers don't always innovate. They optimize. They master the fundamentals. They commit to a few core behaviors and get better at them every single day. Reinvention sounds exciting. It gives the illusion of progress. It lets you escape the boredom of discipline. But most people who constantly reinvent aren't evolving. They're avoiding. They're avoiding mastery. Avoiding the discomfort of refinement. Avoiding the responsibility of sticking with something long enough to build. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Depth. But if you want to build something that lasts, you have to resist the urge to abandon what you've already built just because it got difficult, just because it got quiet, just because the results slowed down. That's not a sign to quit. It's a signal to refine, to step back, to study, to optimize. Real progress often feels repetitive. It's doing the same thing. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional, with more excellence, more detail, more intention. It's listening more closely, adjusting more precisely, showing up with more presence, more energy, more consistency. And the people who win long term, they love that part because they've made peace with repetition. They don't need constant excitement to stay engaged. They need progress. Refinement requires. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Humility. It asks you to let go of ego, to admit that even what's working could work better. That your process, your habits, your delivery, they can all be sharpened. And when you take that approach consistently, you build something that doesn't just succeed, you build something that scales, something that lasts. You see it. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. Everywhere. The people who go the distance are rarely the flashiest. They're the ones who outlast, who out-arn, who outray. They don't chase every trend. They know what works, and they go deeper. While others get distracted, they keep building. While others pivot out of boredom, they master their craft. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Doesn't mean you never change directions, but it means when you do, it's strategic, not emotional. It means you're not running from discipline, you're evolving with clarity. You're shifting based on growth, not fear, not fatigue, not hype. So the question is, where do you need to refine right now? Where are you still operating with? This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Outdated habits? Where are you still using average effort? Where have you settled for good enough, instead of asking, how can I make this great? Refinement doesn't mean overhaul. It means attention. It means precision. It means looking at your calendar, your routines, your conversations, and asking what's working and how can. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. I elevate it? That's how lasting success is built. Not in dramatic leaps, but in consistent upgrades. You don't have to change everything. You don't have to rebuild your life. You just have to be honest. Honest about where you've gotten comfortable. Honest about where your edge is dull. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Honest about where you could be sharper, stronger, more disciplined. That honesty, that's the door to your next level. Because reinvention without discipline leads to chaos. It leads to constant starting over. But refinement with discipline, that leads to mastery. And mastery is what gives you sustainability. It's what allows you to perform. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, with excellence for decades, not just for one season. This is how people become trusted, how they become respected, how they become consistent forces, not just successful people. They stay committed to the process of refinement. They don't get bored with the basics. They don't crave constant change. They crave growth. and growth lives inside refinement. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. Now walked through 5 strategic approaches. Not theories, not trends, but foundational truths. The kind that don't just help you win for a moment, but help you keep winning. The kind that hold under pressure, that scale with growth, that evolve as you evolve. These aren't strategies you visit once and move on from. These are. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The patterns that define how you live, how you think, how you lead yourself through every season. You learn that lasting success doesn't come from chasing your preferences. It's built on principles, on non-negotiables, on a deep alignment with your values that doesn't shift when your mood does. That foundation isn't always glamorous, but it's what allows you. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, to stay grounded in the storm. You understood the power of systems, that your life will not rise with your intentions. It will fall to the level of your routines. Systems make excellence repeatable. They eliminate chaos. They protect your energy. They reduce decision fatigue. And most importantly, they keep you in motion on. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The days when motivation disappears. You saw the importance of long-term vision paired with present urgency, that the goal isn't just to dream big. It's to act now, every day, every block of time, every opportunity. You stop waiting for ideal conditions and start working toward a future that's already written into your schedule, your behavior. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, your belief. You recognize that external success without internal stability is a ticking clock. That true confidence is built from within, not through applause, but through presence, through habits, through emotional strength. You don't want to rise quickly, only to collapse quietly. You want to grow in a way that's real, sustainable, and peaceful. That begins on the inside. And finally, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You learned the difference between reinvention and refinement. That you don't need to keep starting over. You don't need to tear it all down every time it gets hard. Most of the time, you just need to sharpen, to go deeper, to get better at what's already working. That's how mastery is formed. That's how legacy is built. These 5 approaches. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Aren't just individual ideas. They're a framework. Together, they create a system that holds you. A structure that guides you, a way of thinking that keeps you in alignment even when circumstances change. They give you a repeatable process for growth, clarity, and performance that will outlast whatever challenge you're currently facing. You don't need to remember. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Everything. You just need to begin living it. Pick one, focus on it. Let it shape your week, then layer the next, then the next. Stack them, align them, make them part of your DNA, not just your goals. That's how lasting success is created. One aligned decision at a time. This isn't about being perfect. It's about... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Being prepared. It's about having a strategy that doesn't need hype to work. A mindset that doesn't fall apart when things get hard. A system you can trust, even on your worst day. Because success isn't built by the version of you who's excited. It's built by the version of you who keeps going, keeps leading, keeps showing up. No. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Matter what? You've got what you need. Now it's time to use it. Build your life on principle. Lead yourself with systems. Think long-term. Move now. Stay grounded internally. Refine constantly and watch what happens when strategy replaces stress, when alignment replaces anxiety, when consistency replaces chaos.